Hey everyone, this is Zach. This is Triple Play Fantasy Beyond the Analyst. We're back again for episode 23. So if you have missed the first 22 episodes, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow on the podcast, catch up on all those. But today I'm joined by the great Jim McCormick. How you doing today, Jim?
Doing well. Love being called great. That's always a good start.
I'm glad we're off to a good start. And if for those who have not listened to any of the prior episodes, please, like I said, don't miss those. But we're not going to ask Jim about his fantasy takes today. I'm sure you have lots of great takes, and it's the off season right now for most sports. So I just want to get to know you a little bit more. We're just going to have some fun talking about you. So I know you are the fantasy football and fantasy basketball analyst for ESPN. So did you play any sports growing up?
I played basketball, but I went to a Quaker school, so there was no. We used to have this T-shirt that said like "undefeated in football since 1850," just because we weren't allowed to play football there, just based on like Quaker, the ethos of just peace. But I played lacrosse, so that's as much violence as we were allowed to have. But I played hoops. Thankfully, I can say that I went to this school, Friend Central, in around Philly, because then when I was there, we weren't very good. But then like, shortly after, they got like several NBA players. Like Hakeem Warwick went there. The guy DeAndre Hunter for the Hawks went there. So now I can like say I went there and it's cool. So, but
There
like
you go.
20 years ago, we were terrible. But mostly a hooper. But I loved football. I grew up with like the Reggie White, Buddy Ryan Eagles. So I thought football was like a blood sport when I grew up because like I was used to like the body bag game, like the and like you're a Cowboys fan. Like I remember like it just felt very important. Like it felt more important than it should have. I guess like in a good way, and that's what really I guess like my football fandom was maybe stronger than my basketball fandom as a kid. But even though I was a hoop player because of where I grew up too.
Yeah, definitely a lot of pride in Philadelphia for the Eagles
It's
team,
shame
especially
and
in that era.
pride. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a good mix. Like
shameful pride. There you go.
exactly. It's pretty. It's a good way to wrap up Philadelphia in general. Shameful pride. So.
Perfect. So what led you to becoming a writer and an analyst of fantasy sports?
Sure, yeah. I mean, like anybody, I was a gamer first, right? Like speaking of the cap, like those old things, like not to always date myself, but like my first draft, I'm 42, so my first draft was in 91, and it was 92, and I drafted Emmett Smith second overall because Barry Sanders went first, and everybody was just like in the room was like, you drafted a cowboy, you're the worst person, but I saw it as like he's in a great position, like so I was already kind of agnostic. And I was able to separate. It was always funny how mainstream media, like that this thing's over now. But when we first came into fantasy, there was this kind of uh, kind of fake conflict, right, of between being a real fan and a fantasy fan, as if you couldn't like separate the two. But what I'm trying to say is that like I knew that divergence existed from day one because I didn't like Emmett Smith, but I was like he might have 20 touchdowns. So I started playing fantasy in the early '90s, but I didn't really get into it like seriously until the late '90s. There was this game called Small World, and it was a cap based game. It was an investment game where everybody had $50,000 of budget, and you would invest in any NBA player, Shaq, anybody, and then sell them back to the market at the price that they were in demand later. So really, if you were really good at just like highlighting good rookies and young players, you may and I ended up like fourth out of like a pool of like thousands of people because I also spent an inordinate amount of time on a free game that came with no rewards other than a leaderboard, right? Like, but my point being, that's was my hook was like this idea that like, and I'm not gonna lie, there is like it was pre-screenshot, but there was something about like, holy crap, that's my name, like. I did well in this little world. It was called Small World, and then Yahoo bought that and kind of ruined it. Like, no offense to Yahoo, but like they didn't know how to handle the game. But then what happened was in the early 2000s, Matt Berry had like this Yahoo group that was called the Talented Mr. Roto, and he would have these like writing contests, and like some good writers came out of it. Like Chris Harris was a couple, like one Brad Harris won one of these contests. I was with Will Brinson in one. And because I have like an incredibly huge Irish Catholic family and stuff at the ballot, I won this writing contest against Will Brinson and was able to then write fantasy football for Matt Berry, like, but for a nominal fee. But this was like when he was still writing Hollywood or he was still in California. And in any case, and this can speak to later about, I mean, like how to like angle yourself into the industry, but like I just like was like willing to do any nerdy position they wanted. And like you'd mentioned to me off air before, like somebody wanted you to talk about the Jaguars once, and you were like, well, damn, I have to do this, I guess. I found that I was like going to find my fit with these guys wherever they needed. I became like a utility man, and in some ways that was my path, but I think everybody has their path, but for me it was just like they needed an IDP guy, and I did naturally already play IDP. And this was like 2005 when that was even more niche. And that helped because Matt Berry was like, I don't know who the hell the safety is. You know what I mean? And I could tell him everything about these depth charts because I'm a nerd. And so I guess Dynasty football really was a big thing that helped me because I was into an IDP Dynasty league before not before anybody. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying, but before these guys, so even among these nerds, they were like, give it to that nerd. So I was able to get like IDP stuff and fantasy basketball stuff that was more fringe. So even in that first job, like Matt Berry one day was like, yo, do you want to write for NBA.com? And I was like, yeah. And it was like $75 a week, which is great, but it was 2 columns. It was a lot of work. But I was writing for NBA.com because at that time, NBA.com, Matt Berry's biggest thing was that he used to be able to find that like these big companies really didn't have anybody that knew about fantasy. Like NBA.com had nobody writing fantasy. And then we found out there was a huge audience. So that's a long way to say that like as a fan, I got lucky on a message board and then stuck with somebody who knew what they were doing. So
that's awesome. So, and eventually you transitioned, I guess, from your career before to like, because you're full time with ESPN, correct?
Yeah, and I'm transitioning eventually into education actually myself now, but I'm still with ESPN, and I just like my season. It's interesting too because like the fantasy industry is changing, and it's becoming merged. And even at ESPN, I can say this: we merged our verticals of betting and fantasy, whereas they used to be like separate. Not to say they're the same thing, but editorially we like hit on a lot of the same stuff, right? We care about ankle injuries. We care, what I mean? Like, we care about like the outcomes, how they influence the games, right? And so. For example, I just finished with basketball because I was writing the betting columns for NBA or like helping write them, and that wasn't true before. I used to finish my NBA season in April, right? Because the regular season was over. So like pre-DFS and pre-legalization of the online game, it's like, so it's just interesting that like, fantasy now, DFS and sports betting, they're not all the same. You can work in these, but it is becoming blended. And that's one of the ways I think to get into the industry too, is just like, not to become a better, but I'm saying be fluent in some of these languages that they want. It's like there's new languages, right? Like, so that's basically like the adaptability that they want you to do. But we all are adapting, right? Like I wasn't putting in 50 lineups every Sunday, 10 years ago. I didn't know what that meant. So we learn how to play the game, and I think that's part of what we're doing as analysts. Like we're learning the game, and we're trying to help other people get better at it.
That's great. And I think some people forget because, I mean, we kind of recency bias, but it wasn't that long ago that, I mean, especially on the big networks, like you didn't talk about betting during the games, right? Like that was very taboo. And now we're always talking about the over and unders and we hit the over. Oh no, we missed it. Or
my first fantasy convention I remember was in like 2008. And like I remember Matt Berry told me to come, like it could be worthwhile, like to pick up gigs too, like for me, like even though I was writing for him. And it was like in a small, and it was in Chicago, and it was cool, but it was a small ballroom. It was like 50 dudes, like doing a mock draft, and like trying to figure out like if Chris Cooley had running back eligibility, like what I mean, like just being nerds. But my point is now it's like it's an entire convention center, so just the game has changed, and that's the thing. Back then, CBS and all these companies and ESPN, they didn't know what to do with it, and it's clear, and the fans have shown them that like it's all we care about, like not all we care about, but like. I can say this too, like nothing drives, like when they come and talk to us at a fantasy meeting, like a higher up, like nothing drives, and this doesn't surprise you, but nothing drives interest like fantasy content. Like, and I think what perplexed people too was like, how do you merge mainstream content with fantasy content? You don't have to. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you don't have to like spin it like that, like somebody's like suspension is fantasy relevant. Just tell us, you know what I mean? Like, it is fantasy relevant. You know what I mean? Like, they were trying to figure out like how to like frame it. And they were like kind of like like they didn't know how to talk about it. You don't have to, like just don't ignore it, right? You know what I mean? Like there's a difference.
Yeah. So we've definitely come a long way, which is
we
great.
have.
It's exciting.
We have. Yeah. Now Al Michaels doesn't have to pretend anymore about betting. Like it's great.
Yeah.
So.
And now I'm not going to make you choose a favorite. That's like choosing your favorite kid. But do you have a preferred fantasy sport that you like to play?
I love fantasy basketball, but it's not my favorite. I still think fantasy football is like the OG. Just like the one day, not one day because we have Mondays, but you know what I mean? Like the condensed rush of it. And like, I don't know, man. I just love the feeling of like, my league doesn't talk as much trash as it used to, my main league, but it used to be really, really fun. And not that it is anymore, but you know, kids and all these things, they change things. But you know, when you're getting crushed at like 145 and the other guy has his whole lineup playing and the whole world seems like it's over. And then like at 3:30, it's a different world. Or like at like 4:45, the world feels different. And that's a sickness, but it's also incredible. Like the rushes. And like, I've never been a big bettor in the way that we were talking, but like, I do bet, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is, like, I can get enough of the volatility and the rush out of fantasy football without kind of needing I don't feel the need to restake all the time, like in games, because fantasy football alone is just such an investment, especially when, not just when things are going well, but like when things, you know, the variance of it all, like, you know, like embrace the variance kind of stuff. Like, you know, there's going to be those terrible days, but sometimes it's awesome. Those comeback Sunday night wins, that stuff, you know, nothing beats that for me.
There's nothing more exciting and more stressful than needing a Monday Night Miracle. And,
oh yeah, and getting it, or
or if it's like a late, like the game goes really late, and you're like, I really should go to bed so I can function tomorrow. But you're like, I can't sleep not knowing if I'm gonna win or not, or if I'm gonna lose.
And then your buddy sends you that like terrible like you win text. You're like, it's just like, you're like, yep.
No, I love that. And now you mentioned before IDP and Dynasty.
Yeah.
Do you have a preferred type of league? I mean, I know I'm sure you're probably league agnostic, but do you have a favorite?
I mean, honestly, traditional fantasy is still awesome to me. Like, I love just playing, like, one of my favorite leagues every year is this Jake Seeley Flex League, just because, like, it's, like, real old school. There's no kicker, but, like, otherwise it's, like, real old school. Not old school, I mean, it's PPR, but I'm just saying, like, it's not difficult to figure out, right? Like, every year. Like, you know where the value lies. But I suppose, if I'm going to be, like, helpful to my IDP brethren, like, I like a league that has some balance as opposed to, I don't like team defense. It's not that I don't like it. It's fine. It's just that it has just as much inherent volatility. Maybe not as much, but comparable volatility to the kicker. Because we're just like choosing this unit, you know what I mean? And we're basically waiting for splash plays. And you can say that about IDP, but like we're getting so much, not we, but like the football community is getting so much better at kind of like knowing who's where on the football field and defense and like knowing who's getting the tackles, that not all linebackers are the same. So it's just more minutia. You're just letting me dive into more cool stuff. You know, I look at it as cool stuff, and like I just think it also incentivizes the nerd, and nerd just means somebody who's super into something, right? So like it incentivizes the person who wants to grind. So sometimes I don't want the league to be too deep. I was in a league one time that was like way too hardcore, and like meaning it just was too much for me. But like we were setting alignments and it mattered, and it was just too much for me on a Sunday morning. Like, but I do like, so I kind of, what I'm trying to say is I like enough complication that like you need to grind. But I also don't want it to be like filing a tax return. So, you know.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, at the end of the day, it's all about having fun. So,
yeah,
so
like 6 to 8 defenders. Yeah.
Perfect. And now, so you're a great recurring guest on the Harris Fantasy Football Podcast. You mentioned Chris Harris before. So you guys have a running gag about the underscore in your Twitter handle.
Yeah.
So obviously, you are the Baron of the underscore.
Right.
But is there an actual origin story to the underscore, or is this just a complete amazing gag?
It's just a gag. Like, it's off the top. Like, he just one day was making fun of me for having an underscore. So I tried to provide value to it and say, like, well, there's a reason. Like, you can't, it's not just an underscore, bro. Like, I profit on. Like, there's, like, it's inherent in my character that I need it. Like, if I didn't have it, I wouldn't be making money. And really what it is there's just some guy, Jimmy McCormick, who tweeted once in, like, 2008 and said, like, what up, Twitter world? And then never tweeted again. And I'm like, can I get that name, bro? And like, you know, like Twitter used to say that they were going to like free up names, and then it just never happened because I guess too many lawsuits. And long story short, I had to do the underscore, and Chris was just like kind of busting me about it one day, and I just made it, I empowered myself. And now he's the one who loves it because he keeps going off on it. But like, it's just, I just riff on it. Like none of it's, obviously it's just all goofy, but yeah, no, Chris is just goofy, and he's I like what he does too, because to speak to like getting into fantasy, he like really leaned into who he is to make his brand. Like ESPN, he did really well there. He was at ESPN for a long time, but then like he gets to just do his film stuff, and he doesn't have to satisfy other, you know what I mean? Like he doesn't want to like try to do, I'll bring up stats and he'll laugh at me. Like now I think it's right to discuss stats, right? Like it's not crazy to talk about like a terrible offensive line and yards per contact and stuff. And he's like, no, he's like, that is a crutch argument and it's ridiculous. But at the same time, we need those different perspectives, right? Because otherwise we would all just be using, we'd all be using the same spreadsheet, right? You know what I mean? Like, yeah. Like we'd all just be drafting the same players. So like sometimes he's wrong, sometimes he's right, but I love that like he has a reason behind it. So, so, but not to get on to Chris Harris, but I'm saying like, we made that thing up, but there's something fun about being on a show with somebody who's willing to make fun of you. So, like,
yeah, no, and I love it. It's part of your walk-up music for the show now. Which is
he's a goofball. So,
but now I don't know if you want to tell him this because I did a little research on Barons, but apparently it's like the lowest level of nobility.
Okay,
so take that for what you want,
but that's also kind of where I do my dirtiest work, like on the outer rings. Do you know what I mean?
You thrive.
That's where the side deals are made.
Yeah.
That's where the side deals are made, bro.
Perfect. But I appreciate you sharing that story. Yeah, I love that podcast, and I always thought
he's a good time, and that's what I'm saying. He's a community, or like I love the Establish the Run guys. Like I love how goofy they are. Like all the just that's the thing about the fantasy football community. We're a bunch of goofballs. So
yeah, that is very true. Speaking of the fantasy football community, there's a lot of new content creators out there, or even people thinking about starting in the fantasy space. I mean, for as terrible as COVID's obviously been, I think it also gave a lot of people time at home to maybe focus on some different hobbies or try their hand at something. So you work for one of the largest sports media companies. I know most people can't relate to that, but do you have any advice for any of those new content creators that are just starting out?
Sure, yeah. And I mean, I've dabbled in startups and all kinds of stuff like that throughout my career too. I've seen I've been in the corporate side, but also like the startup and trying to get your voice outside. But in any case, I mean, there's no singular answer, of course, right? But what you said, I think about COVID in terms of how it kind of helped people not help people, but it kind of like forced people in some ways to look a little inward and like pursue their passions and dabble to keep yourself going and to also, like you said, flex different muscles. I think the main thing is like, it sounds it's such a corny thing, but it's just like passion. You have to really care and it's going to come through. But like, I've been in the game a long time, and not that it means I'm great. I'm saying, but it's cool because I've seen some people start. Like I remember, like when Matt Harmon had like, just like a couple thousand followers, and he was building his voice, but it was a very unique voice, and he wasn't there was nothing phony about it. It was just this authentic attempt to like frame the game. Now he had a great angle with the reception perception, but I just think that like a lot of people who come up now, who people break in. They have some level of authority to their voice or it doesn't mean you have to invent a metric. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, I think like you have to have like some level of authenticity of how much you care and some level of authority with the information that you're wielding. You know what I mean? Like one of my favorite analysts is Rich Rebar with Sharp, and he's been everywhere, but like, he's like super humble about it, but he commands information really well. And I just think that's my best way to say it would be like, this word expert's ridiculous. Like there's no expert, but I think what it is expertise is not a made up word. It's like care and become good at it. And I guess maybe in some ways like, not that you always have to choose the left field, be different thing, but just, you have to workshop it and get good at it. Like, I don't think this is one of those things where, like, there's nothing like that where you're great right away, but I think it's one of those things where you like don't like quit if your first thing isn't hitting, So I don't know, and get your voice out there. That's the best part. There's so many podcasts, there's so many different ways. So I'm all over the place, but my main point would be like to establish like some level of authority, and like basically what I'm saying is when people listen to you, they have to feel like they learned something. So like I think some people, what I'm trying to say is like Adam Levitan, for example, is a really good communicator. And like he is a great gamer, right? Like but his best thing is he can just explain it to you really quickly. Like, guys, this is why Baltimore is a problem. And whereas it might take me 10 minutes to get that out. You know what I mean? So like kind of, I guess my thing is try to identify what you're good at. You know what I mean? And it's because like, I don't think it used to be, they used to tell me like, be good at everything, like do video, podcast, all this shit. Like, I don't know about that, bro. Like, like I don't think everybody can be a data scientist and a podcaster. You know what I mean? Like all these different things. Find something you're good at and see if it can make an impact, right? Like, I think that's kind of it. Like, for example, Chris's thing is he watches more film than anybody else would want to. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's these people who are like film grinders, and then there's Chris watching like every game twice. Yeah, that's different. You know what I mean? Like, so, or like, I keep saying these names, but like Brad Evans, like he just like he's like loud and screams a lot, and he's funny, but like he'll tell you that's his style. Like, so, you know, just bring something to the table, I guess, right? Like, it's also like, think about it this way, like in your leagues, it is a little bit differentiate or die, isn't it? Like, especially in like a tough fantasy league, like you kind of have to do something a little different sometimes. You have to try to make some if stuff's not working. So, I don't know. I kind of would take that approach.
No, I like that. I think it really does, like you said, come down to passion. Like,
Yeah.
if you don't really believe what you're saying or care about what you're saying, no one else is going to believe you.
We'll know it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's a great, and like you said, you just got to stick with it. I mean, it's a process. It takes time.
It is.
So, yeah, no,
And I
like
think
all
be
that
you. I think like meaning like not the like saying like people will know it too, right? Like, and you'll find you'll find your audience.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate that. And that was kind of the last of my, we'll call them the serious questions, if you will.
Sure.
I have some rapid fire questions if you're game.
Go for it.
Awesome. So these are all Philly themed, if you will. You can add as much context or as little context. It can be one word if you want. Whatever
Sure.
you need to answer the question.
Sure.
All right. First one. Do you trust the process?
I do trust the process, and I trust process over results as a theory, as a operating theory, especially in fantasy, because man, the results can really throw you off sometimes, can't they?
Especially in fantasy.
Yes.
So where is the best cheesesteak?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I lived in Roxborough for a while in Philadelphia, so there's this place, D'Alessandro's, that like gets the sleeper run a lot. But I'm gonna be like a tourist and say that Jim's on South, just because it's greasy and I just kind of like it. Like, and it's like of the big names, it's the one that I would go to.
Awesome. And then what is in your favorite cheesesteak?
I'm gonna go like Philly Dirtball. I'm going like Whiz Wit. I'm going like Cheese Whiz, like just fake cheese with a ladle and some fried onions.
Awesome. And so this is maybe the one take that I'm going to ask you for, but we can have fun with it. Should the
Sure.
76ers give James Harden a max contract?
Oof. They shouldn't, but I would, like, if that's what it takes to get him to hang out with me, and like, sure. But the good news is that it seems like it's going to turn into like a 3-year deal, which like, you know, it's kind of like, you don't want to buy a house with James Harden. You want to kind of lease one with him. Do you know what I mean? Like, you want to have that out, but you also don't want to like just get signed a 1-year lease with him, because then it's going to get weird, you know, and he's going to start like wanting to move out. So 3 years is the medium. I would hope for that. I would give him max money, but shorten the years, because I just don't know like how many strip clubs can this guy go to, you know, so.
You need that bumper year in there. There you go.
Exactly. Yeah.
What is your favorite tasty cakes?
Kind of gonna go with the coffee cake. The coffee cake, like, it's just safe. It's so safe.
Classic. Delicious. And then who are your top 3 Philly athletes after Nick Foles?
That's good. I'm also gonna take out Allen Iverson, because he's like an obvious. Because like you said,
Okay.
just because it's too obvious. I would just say him. But I'm gonna say Embiid, because he's just so funny on Twitter. Like, that's most of it. He's incredible at basketball, but I just love that he's funny. Brian Dawkins, because he turned into Wolverine, like, on the field. And then I'm gonna say Randall Cunningham, because he got me into the game, and he used to be like, not that people don't remember, but like, he did the wackiest stuff. Like, he literally like would escape. He would like handstand to get away from a sack and then throw a touchdown. And I think he still has the longest punt in NFL history. So there you go.
That's awesome. And not to make it about me, but I did get to meet Brian Dawkins once at Hollywood Studios. He rented a stroller from me.
Oh, there you go. He was a nice guy, I bet, because he's always been a
Super
great guy.
nice. Yeah,
Yep.
I immediately
Yep.
recognized him, and I was like, "What name do you want me to put on the back of your stroller?" Because I assume you don't want
Yeah,
your name on the
B-Dog,
stroller.
yeah.
And I don't remember what name he chose, but it's some obscure random name. But yeah, he was
Sure.
super nice. Yeah,
Sure.
Very
If you guys-
very large gentleman. Yes.
I know this, but if you ever look it up, just Google Brian Dawkins Takeo spikes, and there's a video about Brian Dawkins says he wants to take a guy's soul out, and he hits this receiver, and he like drops to the ground and says hallelujah, and like the rest of the defense was just like, what, he did an exorcism like on the field. So you just don't see that stuff. Yeah.
No, that's not in the NFL anymore.
No, it's not.
Good or
It's not.
bad, not in the NFL yet.
Exactly. Good or bad, right?
Awesome. So that was the last of my rapid fire questions. I think you crushed them.
Cool.
And so thanks for taking the time to share a little bit more about you to everyone. Do you mind sharing, I guess, where everyone can find all of your awesome work?
Sure, yeah, as we said, like underscore Jimmy McCormick, because it just wasn't available. That's on Twitter. And then if you just like from there, I have, my link to my ESPN stuff, but basically like mostly NBA fantasy stuff you'll see. And then NFL fantasy is coming around the corner. We have IDP rankings. I help curate those. And I'll do a couple IDP breakout things. So, just nerdy stuff, but it's coming. I just did a draft a couple of nights ago for a magazine. I can't. They still make those, but yeah. I mean, like it's coming. Like I was in a draft room and I was like, wow, like nobody wants Julio Jones. So yeah,
That's very true.
yep.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. So for those of you who are watching on YouTube, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the Triple Play Fantasy channel. We have a lot of great content coming out, not just football. We got baseball and basketball as well, plus even some movie stuff and some foodies. And then if you're listening on the podcast, make sure you download, subscribe, so you don't miss any of the great episodes and all the great content we have coming out right now to get you ready for football. So thanks again, Jim, and have a great one, everyone.
Thanks.